everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Ukraine is keeping up its energy sanctions campaign on Russia with more successful long-range strikes, further exacerbating the fuel shortages affecting the country. Meanwhile, Ukraine faces its own energy challenges as winter approaches. The country will need to import about €4 billion worth of natural gas to cover its lost production. Now, Donald Trump says that he thinks that he's made a decision to sell Tomahawk cruise missiles to NATO so they can be transferred to Ukraine. So is this just a threat, or will the United States president follow through? We'll discuss these issues and more with our guests, but first, let's take a look at this report from Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held the operational debut of the domestically produced FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles on October 6th, confirming its use in strikes deep inside Russia. As U.S. President Donald Trump edged closer to approving Tomahawk cruise missile transfers amid strained D.C.-Kremlin ties. The Flamingo, boasting a 3,000-kilometer range and a 1,150-kilogram warhead, entered serial production at 2 to 3 units daily, with plans to scale it up to 7 by the month's end, bolstering Kyiv's asymmetric edge. Trump, in his White House remarks on October 6th, revealed that he had sort of made a decision on supplying the Tomahawks via NATO allies, but stressed needing Ukraine's targeting plans to avoid escalation. This week, Russia unleashed relentless aerial barrages on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, devastating power and gas networks in a deliberate pre-winter campaign, while Ukraine retaliated with precision strikes crippling Russian fuel supplies. This week's deadliest assault came on October 10th. Over 50 missiles and 200 drones targeted 9 regions, killing 5, wounding dozens, and blacking out parts of Kyiv and Lviv. With Ukrainian Energy Minister Svetlana Hrinchuk describing it as a massive strike on the grid. Earlier hits between October 3rd and 5th ravaged Naftogaz's sites in Kharkiv and Poltava, the war's largest attack on gas infrastructure, halting production and risking chaos for millions. The attack prompted urgent pleas from Zelensky for EU LNG imports via Poland and Slovakia. Kyiv fought back fiercely. Flamingo missiles and drones struck Russia's Sverdlov explosives plant and the Feodosia oil terminal in occupied Crimea on October 6th, igniting massive blazes and disrupting the supply of 250,000 tons of fuel for the invaders. Hits on the Kirishi and Tuapse refineries idled key units, fueling Russia's gasoline crisis, with exports banned through 2025. Prices soaring, and 40% of its refining capacity taken offline since August. Russian forces scraped out marginal advances in Donetsk between October 6th and 10th, seizing under 200 square kilometers near Pokrovsk and Dobropilya. But Ukrainian defenders say they've exacted over 15,000 casualties, stalling Moscow's push amid a grinding 200 daily clashes. Geolocated footage showed drones shredding Russian convoys near Sharkove and Zatishok, with elite Ukrainian brigades repelling assaults in Liman and Novopavlivka, holding the fortress belt. Putin boasted of 5,000 square kilometers captured in 2025 overall this week, claiming that strategic initiative, but the Institute for the Study of War assessed a 34% drop in monthly gains, with no breakthroughs in Kharkiv or Zaporizhia. And now joining us is Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert editor at the Atlantic Council. Hello, Peter, and thank you so much for joining us again on Ukraine This Week.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, now recent attacks have crippled the already strained and fragile energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, concerning this development, do you think that this winter we will see a very different scenario than we've seen in the winters past? And I'm very much aware of how resilient Ukraine has been in fixing the energy infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure after such attacks. But it looks like Russia is certainly ramping up the attacks on the energy infrastructure. And what are your predictions for this winter?
Yeah, the last few days have seen some very heavy attacks. In fact, actually today we're speaking on October the 10th, which is the third anniversary of the very first major Russian bombardment of Ukraine's energy sector. So this is nothing new. This has been going on consistently every single winter of the war. In fact, actually, this will be the fourth winter of the war where we've seen these sort of attacks. Now, it started quite early this year. And we've had a lot of blackouts across Ukraine, here in Kiev today, in other cities. That's going to be a feature, I would imagine, unfortunately, throughout the winter season. But Ukrainians are used to this. They know how to respond. The authorities, the energy sector, they know how to get in and repair the grid as quickly as possible. There's also a lot of work being done to secure supplies of energy, electricity, and also of gas from abroad, LNG gas being imported, other forms of gas being imported across from the EU, including from Poland. There will be efforts to provide alternative sources of energy inside Ukraine. Measures have already been taken to establish some reserve power sources that are being based underground, some of it, to protect it from bombardment. So there's all sorts of efforts underway. And this is, again, I repeat, this is nothing new. But of course, the longer it goes on, the more damage that is done, the harder it gets to repair these systems. So it's going to be a very challenging winter. And I think it's quite clear from Russia's actions that we can expect the worst, essentially, in terms of the scale of bombardment they're going to embark on.
That's a very real fear. Now, Russia is also attacking, as you mentioned, the gas infrastructure. They've taken 60% of the domestic gas production offline. Will we see shortages this year? Do you think that the country is going to be able to fill the gap, which is estimated at 4.4 billion cubic meters of gas this year?
Well, there's going to be shortfalls. I think they're going to try and cover that gap via imports primarily. So at this stage, the challenge is twofold: it's to find the imports, to find the spare capacity elsewhere to import that gas, and then also, of course, to pay for it. So Ukraine has been reaching out to the country's international partners, to international financial organizations, also to Ukrainian banks. So Naftogaz, Ukraine's big energy company, has been announcing a series of deals in the last couple of weeks to finance the import of gas from different sources. What I think we will see now is the next stage of Russia's campaign. Russia will try to target those imports. They won't be bombing outside of Ukraine, of course, but they will be trying to target the pipeline systems, the storage facilities, the logistics and transit hubs that Ukraine uses to bring this gas in, to try and prevent the gas, essentially the imported gas, from reaching Ukraine. So it's going to be a very, very, multitasking for Ukraine to try and get this gas in, to try and find it, to try and pay for it, and then to try and bring it in and get it to where it needs to be to support the Ukrainian civilian population. I'm sure there's going to be shortfalls. Past experience suggests that they're extremely resourceful and they will find ways to overcome a lot of these obstacles. But the scale is so big that there's going to be shortfalls. There's going to be a cold winter.
Right now, I'd like to move on to these potential Tomahawks. We heard Donald Trump say that he thinks that he's decided to provide Tomahawks to NATO so that they can be transferred, of course, to Ukraine. Now, if this does happen, it's probably not going to happen in the numbers that is equivalent to how many targets there are, especially deep in the Russian rear. So, on your just best guesstimates, what would be the most likely targets for such weapons? What would be the smartest use of Tomahawks if and when Ukraine gets them?
Well, it's looking more and more likely that Ukraine will get some Tomahawks, which in itself is pretty remarkable. Of course, we'll have to wait and see. We don't want to preempt that and be premature. But certainly, the fact that it's even being discussed is fairly significant. If Ukraine receives even a small number, I think they would look to strike certainly energy targets, but also military targets. They would look to hit some logistics hubs to try and disrupt Putin's war machine. So I think key targets would be oil refineries, would be major transport hubs that that are used by the military, and also military industrial sites such as the production facilities for the drones that we have in Tatarstan, for example. That would be one very, very prime target. So I think they would use these drones. They would use these Tomahawks to try and strike very high-profile targets. Essentially, the Tomahawks will be used by the Ukrainians, and they've said as much themselves. They will be used as a deterrent rather than a strike force. Of course, the Ukraine is looking to damage Putin's war machine, but most of all, what they're looking to do is send a message to Putin and to the Russians that they have the capability to bring this war to Russia on a very serious scale. That's something that the Ukrainians said, and that's something I think, as I understand it, is also how the Americans envisage this, that the Tomahawks will be primarily a deterrent, a weapon of deterrence that would be held by the Ukrainians for potential retaliation. So they'd certainly want to use them. They'd certainly want to demonstrate that they have them. But first and foremost, they'd look to have a stockpile to be able to say to the Russians, look, if you continue and if you strike hard in Ukraine, we'll strike back, and you won't have the defense. You're not capable of preventing it, and the damage will be very severe.
Yes, now a lot of people are talking about platforms because these are sea-based, sea-launched missiles, but Ukraine is going to have to adapt. We're perfectly well aware that Ukraine can definitely adapt, but how do you see them taking on this challenge?
Well, it's the latest in a series of similar challenges. We've had the same thing over various different artillery systems, various different air-to-air and ground-to-air missile systems that have been provided to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are the ultimate MacGyver nation, as it were. They are incredibly adaptable. They're able to take weapon systems from the West and adapt them to implement them in different ways. And in many ways, they've also been able to improve them. So at this stage, it's too early, I think, to speculate on exactly what kind of solutions they come up with. But I'd be very confident that that's not going to be a major issue. The Ukrainians will find a way. The big issues here around Tomahawks are really political, geopolitical, in terms of America's appetite for risk and their appetite for getting more involved in this war. The technical aspects, I think, will be overcome because that's what Ukraine does best.
Now, the Flamingo also made its debut, or it seems this way. Some reports coming out of Crimea that it was used there. This is also a long-range missile, a homebrew missile, if you will. But it's also said that they're quite easily intercepted. Is there some way that the cruise missiles, the Tomahawks and the Flamingos could be used side by side to maybe overwhelm or trick the air defense systems of Russia, allowing the more crucial strikes to be successful?
Well, I think it's too early to make any judgments on the interceptable nature of the Flamingo or not. I think we've had reports of them being used on a couple of occasions, and the reports that we've received seem to be that they've been very successful, that they've hit their targets in most cases and caused considerable damage. I'm sure the Russians would have a different version of that, but I think overall, we're talking about very small numbers of use, so it's a bit early to draw any definitive conclusions. But yeah, I think if we talk about Russia's air defenses, Russia does have pretty sophisticated air defenses, but they're limited in scope. The Russians are clearly unable to protect their oil and gas industry, their refineries, from drones, which are obviously very slow moving and relatively easy to see and to identify and to target. So you would imagine that they'll have more difficulty shooting down cruise missiles. So it may well be a case that if Russia is able to intercept some of these Flamingos, it will be a matter of overwhelming them just in terms of volume. So we want to see a flock of Flamingos, as it were, if that's the correct term for a large number of Flamingos. I'm not sure, but flocks of flamingos would certainly create a lot of problems for Russia's already overstretched air defenses. And if Ukraine is, as people suspect that Ukraine is now stockpiling these missiles, they've been in production for some time now. And so the current estimates is they may have as many as a few hundred stockpiled. So if they start firing dozens at a time at individual targets, I think there's a very good chance that some of them are going to get through.
Surely. Now, that being said, we all know that the Kerch Bridge is it's a major target, not just for the logistics that it provides the Russians and their ability to bring military equipment and what have you onto the peninsula, but it's also a big psychological one. But do you think it's a ripe time to hit the Kerch Bridge with such weapons as the Flamingos and the Tomahawks, or are there more important places that Ukraine needs to focus on first?
It's certainly not a strategic priority. Russia does use it for some logistics, but it's not the only route they have to Crimea. So it's not a bottleneck in that sense. It wouldn't leave Crimea isolated if it were cut off. Crimea can still be resupplied by air, by sea, and by land through the occupied southern Ukraine. So it's not got that strategic importance now, which perhaps it had in the very first months of the war. And you're quite right that it has huge symbolic importance. It's a symbol of Russia's imperial campaign in Ukraine, of Russia's campaign of conquest. So it is in that sense an important symbol, and it would be a very, very powerful message if Ukraine were able to damage or even destroy the bridge. But it's not certainly from a military sense high in the strategic priorities. Ukraine's priorities now, I think, are quite clearly the Russian war machine inside Russia itself, rather than occupied Ukraine. They're very much focused on the oil and gas industry and the arms production industry. Those are the absolute top priorities, and I think they'll remain so.
Yes. Now, also, Trump says that he will have to sign off, or that he wants to know which targets Ukraine will strike these U.S.-provided the cruise missiles with. Which targets do you think are off limits for the United States?
I would imagine it would be certainly anything that would involve the high risk of civilian casualties. So any targets like within the urban space of Moscow or St. Petersburg, for example. Perhaps anything that's personally associated with Putin. Trump certainly wouldn't want to see American missiles used to start blowing up any of Putin's many palaces and residences. So I think they would certainly be off limits. Civilian casualties will be a factor. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think the Americans have actually been quite open about, they don't object to Ukraine's strikes against Russia's energy industry. I think they see that as a legitimate military response from Ukraine, and a legitimate military target in the sense that this is the engine of Putin's war machine, and certainly, obviously, anything that was a direct military target. So I think really we're talking about major cities and things personally related to Putin. I think beyond that, I would imagine the Americans would be happy to say, all's fair in love and war, as it were. These are legitimate targets.
Yeah, now, Peter, we had you on 2 weeks ago. We were talking about these great sanctions that Ukraine is placing on Russian energy sector. Yet 2 weeks have passed. We've seen more things blown up. We've seen this fuel dump in occupied Crimea and Feodosia burn for 3 days now. Just how much progress do you think that Ukraine has made in this direction in terms of creating shortages, problems for Russians, problems for the Kremlins and their coffers? Is this strategy working, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's definitely working. I think it's the most effective strategy Ukraine has come up with to date in terms of really bringing this war home to the Russian people. It's hard to quantify exactly because the Russians are very, very careful about what information they leak out. But it's clear that the number of regions that are being affected by fuel shortages and by gasoline shortages is growing. So more and more ordinary Russians are being introduced to the harsh realities of this war, as it were. Whereas perhaps in the past it had been something that went on very far away and they could just ignore it. Essentially, now it's coming home to them. They're having to accept that. Now, that's not going to turn around and create some sort of revolution overnight, but it will wear away at support for the regime, for Putin himself, and for the war. It will also lead to sort of knock-on effects in terms of other logistics. It's not only about individuals not being able to fill up their cars at a petrol station. It also means that shops won't be able to get restocked, and so on and so forth. So I think as this goes on, we're only 2 months into this campaign now. As it goes on, once we get 3, 4, 5 months in, early next year, there could be really systemic problems for Russia that are going to have a big impact, A, on the way they're able to manage this war, and B, in terms of the mood in the country and the appetite that the Russians have, their readiness to support the war.
Yes, and there's also talk of the potential for, or the possibility that Russia is going to have to import fuel or oil. This was unconceivable not very long ago, as you just mentioned. Not just a couple months ago, this was unconceivable even. Will this be a major turning point if Russia has to do that? And with the coffers drying up, with the money drying up, how in the world is it going to import fuel and oil from abroad?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, we've already seen just the other day that I think Reuters, I believe, reported on the amount of oil that Russia was importing from Belarus had quadrupled in September. So this is already happening. We're already seeing Russia turn around and importing fuel. Now, if they have to do it, the irony of ironies will be Russia importing fuel from China. Of course, in recent years, Russia has essentially become a kind of colonial appendage to China and become, taken on the role of providing China with its raw materials in the sort of classic colonial model. And now it would seem that Russia not only provide China, it's actually going to have to go to China and ask for imports from China. So that'll be very damaging for Russia's prestige. But from an economic point of view, of course, also, you're quite right, it'll be very challenging for them. Not only will they not be earning from fuel exports, but they will be losing money from the budget from imports. That's going to have an impact. And Russia will pay for that in the short term by simply cutting elsewhere. It'll cut costs for other things. It will cut costs on social payments, on payments for the Russian people. So again, they will see that living standards will be impacted. And all these things will have a cumulative effect, I think. So people will have less fuel. They're seeing the government with less money. They're seeing less spending. Overall, they're seeing an economic crisis building up. And at some point, you have to assume it will reach a critical mass. When that happens, we don't know, but it's certainly moving in that direction at the moment.
Yes, and right now, of course, they're working on these frozen Russian assets, giving them to Ukraine in the form of a loan. If Russia doesn't pay reparations after a ceasefire peace is made, then, of course, Ukraine will not have to pay this back. How do you think that this is progressing at this point? Do you think that this is indeed that kind of workaround that they were looking for essentially 3.5 years now?
Well, 3.5 years, you're quite right to underline the length of this process, of this debate. I think that speaks volumes, I think. Essentially, the justice of giving this money to Ukraine is clear to everyone. But the money men, as it were, the financial markets, they're very, very cautious. They're very reluctant to seize these assets because of the precedent it would set. Because unfortunately, and if we speak frankly here, a large amount of the money held by these big financial organizations comes from governments that behave in ways that we might not necessarily condone. So if it becomes legitimate to strip Russia of all this money because we don't like the way they behave in Ukraine, then other countries will turn around and say, well, they might not like the way I behave soon because I behave in ways that they also don't like. So it would strike a blow at the very heart of these financial institutions and this financial system. So there's huge reluctance there. There's a lot of resistance. Now I think because the Americans are taking a step back and because they're saying to the Europeans, this is your problem, you have to handle this yourself, but we'll sell you the weapons, we'll sell them to you. I think the Europeans are now saying, okay, now we need to get a lot of money together to buy these weapons. Where are we going to get that money from? If we take it from our own national budgets, there's going to be a very contentious issue for our own electorates. but we can now take this Russian frozen money. So essentially, the Europeans have been very, very incentivized to find a solution to this problem, this very thorny issue. So I think we're moving in that direction now, and I think it's purely because the Americans have said you've got to pay for it yourselves. So perhaps now we will finally see a solution, but it's going to be very challenging, because I say, because institutionally there is huge reluctance, because they really see this as a potentially very dangerous move and a very dangerous precedent to set, and they're very much against it. So it's going to be a battle. It's not going to be simple, but where there's a will, there's a way, and certainly the Europeans are very, very motivated now.
Yes, and it would be great to see not the European taxpayers pay for this war, but Russia. All right, final question here. Donald Trump missed out on his Nobel Peace Prize, not making it this year, but he's still in the running. He can still potentially get it next year. In terms of Ukraine, and very briefly, what do you think Donald Trump would have to accomplish to get the endorsement from President Zelensky?
Well, he needs to broker a peace that is lasting, and that is perhaps justice a bit too justice might be too ambitious at this stage, but it needs to be a lasting peace which guarantees Ukraine's survival as an independent sovereign state. And in order to do that, Trump has to give Ukraine the tools to have some sort of deterrence against Russia. So Tomahawks is the one we're talking about now. There are other things as well, but Trump needs to provide Ukraine with those capabilities to be able to defend themselves and to be able to act as a deterrent against future Russian invasion. Of course, we can also hope that Trump would provide some sort of security guarantees. I think that's less likely than providing Ukraine with the tools to act themselves. But whatever it may be, Trump needs to be the man who brokers a deal that guarantees Ukraine's survival as a sovereign, independent state. If he does that, Zelensky will back him for the Nobel Prize. The Europeans will back him for the Nobel Prize. I think everybody but the Russians themselves will back him for the Nobel Prize.
Well, that would be great to see. Still, next year to come, hopefully we can expedite all of these processes right now. Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert editor at the Atlantic Council, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you for joining us. Remember to join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Hope to see you then. Goodbye.